What we're going to touch on now are the three different types of options you have in terms of primary ways of going into business. The first one is creating a business from scratch. You know, if you have a really good idea, we encourage you to go out and develop it. If you don't have an idea or the skills to do that, then the next option is to buy an existing business. This is something that somebody else has started and built to a certain point, something where there's a historic track record, there's predictable cash flow, and you're going to pay a premium for that predictability. The third option is you can buy a franchise business. This is typically the least risky way for somebody to go into business, especially if it's your first time in business. So we'll spend more time in this area. Starting a business from scratch is the most common way that people go into business for themselves. Again, if you have a really good idea, I would encourage you to do that. The advantages of going into business starting from scratch are, number one, you have a complete control. Nobody tells you what to do, when to do it. That means that you get to make all of the decisions, you get to call the shots, you have a ton of room for creativity. This is critical because starting a business from scratch, you're going to need to create systems and processes, and with that creativity you're going to have to come up with those ideas in order to make things work. There are no predetermined rules so that you can do anything that you want or feel like doing. It also has the biggest upside because you're starting that biggest from zero, and you get to keep all the profits, all of the equity value that you build in that business over time. A lot of start from scratch businesses are started from having a passion for something, and this can be very fulfilling. But it's not all rosy. There are certain disadvantages that you want to be aware of when you think about starting a business from scratch as well. While we mentioned that creativity is an advantage, the disadvantage is that you have to create the systems from scratch, and this is where industry experience is so critical. Think of this as you want to build a boat. You go to the edge of the water, you gather all of the wood, the nails, all the parts that you need, and you throw it in the water and you jump on the biggest piece of wood, and you start hammering and putting things together as you're floating down the river. The metaphor is the marketplace is the river. Well, you don't know what the currents are, you don't know the depth of the water, you don't know the speed, and you don't know the dangers. But you know how to build a boat. That's the good idea. A lot of risk to that. You have limited financing options. Banks are very reluctant to lend money to start from scratch businesses that are unproven. So you typically have to use your own financial resources in order to fund that business. Because you're building systems from scratch in the business and often reinvesting in that business, it's very common for these businesses to take a very long time to ramp up to profitability. It can take years before you're making money, and you have no way of knowing how well your idea or product is going to work or how well it's going to be accepted in the marketplace. An important disadvantage for consideration is that you have no one to turn to for support. You can talk to your lawyer for legal advice. You can talk to your accountant for financing advice. But you have nobody in your corner that understands your business that can coach you or guide you on how to run your business. You're alone. A big disadvantage of starting a business from scratch is that these businesses carry the highest failure rate. Depending on what year data you read, from Industry Canada, you're seeing a 40 to 49% failure rate after 5 years in business. A lot of people that start businesses from scratch are younger. They're thinking that, geez, if this doesn't work out, I still have some runway left to reset my career and recover. For people who are older, they don't have that runway. They have one time to get it right. Now let's look at buying an existing business. The next way of going to business is to buy an existing business, something somebody else has already built, and there are several advantages here. One of the biggest advantages is that there's cash flow predictability and some degree of goodwill, so that you get to see the financial and the historical results. I would suggest to you that this is one of the biggest reasons why people consider buying an existing business. Goodwill is the intangible value of the business's relationships in the marketplace. Relationships with customers, relationships with staff, as suppliers. Goodwill often ensures the retention of these relationships as the business transitions to the new owner. The financial history and track record make this type of business appealing for financing by some lenders. Depending on the nature of the business, there's often a customer base and a location that you're inheriting as a part of the purchase of the business. You also have trained and skilled employees in place who help you to manage through the transition. Because the previous owner will have likely created some systems and processes, you'll be able to take over and optimize those systems and processes. One of the other big advantages of this type of business purchase is that the existing owner will finance some of the purchase. We call it seller financing or vendor take-back. This is where if the business costs you $300,000 to buy, then you might pay the owner $200,000 up front and then subsequent payments of $50,000 at 3 months and 6 months each, so that the owner is there with you as you transition and you get to spread the payment out over time. As a matter of fact, I would recommend that you insist that the current owner finance some of the existing purchase. That helps them stay focused on making sure you're successful when you take the business over. One of the biggest disadvantages is it's really hard to determine what the actual cash flow is. While you can see the historical results, you don't know just how much that current owner is running through their company for personal lifestyle needs. For example, what is their cell phone? Do they run their car through? What other expenses are they running that you might not need to? So it reduces the profitability of the business for tax purposes. It's really hard to get all of that information and sorted out. Another disadvantage is that sometimes bad will exists, but you can't see it. You don't know if there's damage to the reputation of the business in the marketplace or what past employees have said, so it's hard to find out what that bad will is. Regarding the valuation of the business and what the price should be for selling it, it's really hard to determine what that value is. Owners almost always have a higher perception of what the value of the business is, and it's very common for existing businesses to be overpriced. One of the reasons why we recommend a vendor take-back is because as a disadvantage, once you buy the business, it's very difficult to control how much, how often, or how frequent the previous owner is going to be available for supporting you and coaching you. When you need them the most, they might be on a trip somewhere funded by the money that you paid for the business. There are always hidden agenda items, hidden seller motives as to why somebody is going to sell their business. And you never really know what that is. They might be telling you that they're selling it because they want to retire, but how do you know? Maybe there's been some negative trends that they've experienced. When you start to ask more questions, there's almost always more to it. One of the questions you want to be asking in the back of your head is this: if this is such a good business, why is the owner selling instead of hiring a full-time manager to run the business so that they can then manage it in the background and still create that annuity income? While we talked about employees in place as being as an advantage, this can also be a disadvantage. You might be inheriting some weak performers or the wrong people in the wrong jobs. You can also see employee defection. Sometimes when businesses change hands, the owners are loyal to the previous owner and they leave after you buy. In some cases, worst case scenario, they leave and go with the previous owner in their next business. That might be a competitor for you. The last disadvantage we'll talk about is that it's common to see higher debt service for the business depending on the type of business you buy. Especially if the purchase price is higher, you've got to fund that purchase through your cash flow from the business. Now let's talk about buying a franchise business. Let's first look at the advantages. Name recognition and trademark protection. The more mature the brand is, the more potency that brand has and that franchisor has in regards of bringing early customers to you as a new franchisee. The next advantage is that franchising is a proven and time-tested business model that works because franchisors use sophisticated processes, sophisticated systems, and marketing intelligence to outperform and outmaneuver independent non-franchised operators. Strong franchisors offer a tremendous amount of coaching and support, pre-launch, launch, after launch, and on an ongoing basis to make sure that you are growing and consistently improving as a franchise operator. Because many franchise locations are operating with the same brand, the same systems and processes, the franchisor is able to create operational roadmaps. The factors that we've just talked about are part of the next advantage, which is that franchisors and franchise business models are very attractive to banks and commercial lenders. It's because of these systems and processes that creates predictability and mitigate risks, and that's what the banks like. One of the biggest and most overlooked advantages is what I call your franchise family. You see, each and every other franchisee in the system will be doing what you're doing day in and day out. and they become a very important support network, peer network, just part of the people you'll be able to talk to, something that only exists in franchising. It doesn't exist in start from scratch or buying existing businesses. With this franchise family, you have a ready pool of like-minded individuals who are motivated and committed to improving the system and sharing that with the other members of that system, you, the other franchisee. Now let's look at some of the disadvantages that come with franchising. The first is that there is a seemingly endless amount of franchise. There's over 1,200 franchise concepts in Canada. Just because it's franchised, it doesn't mean it's good. It means it's been duplicated. There are a number of systems in the market today that I wouldn't walk from, I would run from. Either they have the inexperienced leadership, or they're undercapitalized, or the trends are moving off the business. Another disadvantage is that a lot of people think franchising is highly structured. For some businesses, there is absolutely a lot of structure, and the disadvantage is that the operator does not have a lot of flexibility. They have to run the business the way the franchisor wants. That's not always the case though. A select number of franchisors have very structured operating systems that leave very little room for operational growth. A lot of franchisors have a more moderate structure, so you have to be aware of what that structure is that you have to comply with. If you're a highly creative individual who wants a lot of freedom and flexibility, franchising might not be the right place for you. For quality control purposes, some franchisors restrict the product range that you can carry. For some people, that's a disadvantage. The last disadvantage we'll talk about today is that in franchising, you have to pay an initial franchise fee and you have to pay an ongoing royalty. Is it a disadvantage or is it a value benefit? It's about understanding value. In a good franchise system, royalty should be built into the profitability model. But again, some people look at royalties as a disadvantage. We're now going to transition into the next segment in this series where we're going to take a look at franchising in a lot more depth.